In the middle of the 14th century, Europe stood at the height of its medieval world, its cities thriving, its trade routes stretching from Asia to the Atlantic, and its people bound together by faith, fear, and fragile hope. Then, without warning, a silent killer emerged from the shadows of commerce and war, creeping along the same roads that carried prosperity. It would come to be known as the Black Death, a name that still chills the blood centuries later. This is the story of how that catastrophe began, how it spread, and how it forever altered the course of human history. In the autumn of 1347, under lowering skies and uneasy winds, ships from the distant ports of the Black Sea drifted silently into the harbour of Messina, bearing more than silk and spice in their shadowed holds. The sailors who staggered onto the docks carried with them a terror no eye could yet name, their bodies mottled with dark swellings, and their breaths rattling like loose shutters in a storm. Merchants whispered of a cursed voyage from the trading outpost of Kaffa, where war and pestilence had conspired beneath besieged walls. There, it was said, dying men had been hurled over ramparts, their corrupted flesh flung into the city as a final act of vengeance and desperation. Whether by arrow, rat, or unseen vapors, the sickness traveled swiftly along the arteries of commerce that bound continents together. Within days of docking, the streets of Messina echoed with the cries of families watching loved ones collapse without warning. The afflicted developed painful swellings in their groins and armpits, hard knots that blackened and oozed, as though the body itself were rotting from within. Fever burned fiercely, delirium followed, and death often arrived within 3 merciless days. Fear moved faster still, driving the healthy to flee inland, unknowingly carrying the invisible scourge with them. From Sicily, the contagion leapt to the Italian mainland, finding fertile ground in crowded cities like Genoa and Venice. In those bustling republics where ships from every known shore converged, the disease spread with ruthless efficiency. Physicians, bound by ancient teachings, prescribed bloodletting and potions of crushed emeralds, yet their remedies faltered before the advancing tide. Priests led solemn processions through narrow streets, incense rising heavenward as prayers begged for divine mercy. But the bells that tolled for the dead began to ring without pause, their iron throats announcing a calamity beyond comprehension. By early 1348, the plague had reached Florence, that proud cradle of art and commerce, where chroniclers would later describe scenes of haunting desolation. Neighbours barred their doors against neighbours, and even kin abandoned one another in the terror of contagion. Markets, once loud with bargaining, fell eerily silent, stalls left untended as vendors succumbed beside their wares. Gravediggers could not keep pace with the mounting corpses, and trenches were carved into the earth to receive the dead in dreadful abundance. Rumours swirled that poisoned wells or malevolent conspiracies lay behind the suffering, for the human mind sought patterns amid the chaos. Across the Alps, the pestilence advanced into the heart of Europe, threading through trade routes toward Marseille. From that French port it radiated inland, consuming villages and towns with indiscriminate hunger. Travellers carried tales of entire households extinguished within a week, their doors marked only by silence. The countryside fared no better than the cities, as isolated farms discovered that distance offered little sanctuary. Livestock wandered unattended in fields, and harvests rotted where they stood, for there were too few hands left to gather them. In monasteries, monks who had devoted their lives to contemplation now faced death in cloistered corridors, heavy with incense and despair. Some interpreted the calamity as divine punishment, a reckoning for sins too numerous to count. Bands of penitents marched from town to town, scourging themselves in public displays of remorse, hoping to appease an angry heaven. Yet the lash did nothing to halt the march of disease, which respected neither piety nor rank. Nobles retreated to country estates, believing stone walls and fresh air might shield them from corruption. Peasants huddled in smoky cottages, clinging to folk charms and whispered prayers as their only defense. By mid-year, the plague's shadow stretched long across the Mediterranean world, darkening every shore it touched. Trade faltered, trust eroded, and the delicate fabric of medieval society began to fray under relentless strain. Still the ships sailed and the caravans moved, for survival demanded motion even as motion spread the scourge. Each sunrise revealed new graves and deepened the collective dread that no corner of Christendom would remain untouched. And as winter approached, cold winds sweeping over Europe carried with them the grim certainty that this was only the beginning of a catastrophe that would reshape the world. By the early months of 1348, the plague that had first appeared in Mediterranean ports was no longer a distant rumour, but a relentless presence advancing deeper into Europe. From the crowded harbours of Marseille, merchants and refugees unknowingly carried the infection inland along ancient Roman roads that had once symbolized the strength of empire. The disease moved with terrifying speed, spreading through villages and market towns that had never imagined such destruction could arrive at their doors. Travelers described entire households falling ill within a matter of days, as fever and swelling overtook the strong and the weak alike. By spring, the pestilence surged northward toward the bustling streets of Paris, a city dense with scholars, clergy, and traders. There, the university's physicians debated the cause of the catastrophe, blaming poisonous vapors or a disastrous alignment of the stars. While scholars argued, the plague crept silently through the narrow alleys and crowded markets, leaving death in its wake. Church bells rang almost without pause as funerals multiplied beyond counting. Graveyards overflowed, forcing authorities to dig vast communal pits where the dead were laid side by side in grim silence. Families who once gathered around hearths now feared the very breath of those they loved. In desperation, some fled the cities for the countryside, believing distance might spare them. Yet the plague travelled with them, hidden in carts, clothing, and the fleas that clung to wandering rats. Across the English Channel, the disease soon arrived in London, one of the largest cities in the medieval world. Its crowded wooden houses and filthy lanes proved the perfect breeding ground for the unseen enemy. Within weeks, the capital was gripped by panic as the death toll rose day after day. Clergy struggled to provide last rites for the dying, often collapsing themselves after tending too many infected souls. Doctors experimented with strange remedies, burning herbs, draining blood, or carrying sweet-smelling posies to ward off foul air. None of it slowed the relentless rhythm of illness and burial. Outside the cities, farms fell eerily silent as labourers succumbed in fields where crops once grew in abundance. Without workers to harvest grain or tend livestock, entire communities faced starvation alongside disease. The roads filled with wandering survivors searching for safety, food, or simply a place untouched by the plague's shadow. But such places were becoming impossibly rare. Fear bred suspicion, and desperate populations searched for someone to blame for their suffering. Whispers of conspiracy spread through towns and villages, accusing strangers and minorities of poisoning wells or invoking dark forces. Violence erupted in several regions as terrified crowds lashed out against imagined enemies. Meanwhile, the plague continued its grim march eastward into the German lands, descending upon cities like Cologne and beyond. Merchants who once carried wine, cloth, and spices now carried only dreadful stories of death. In monasteries, monks recorded the devastation with trembling hands, aware that their chronicles might soon end abruptly. Some communities attempted isolation, closing gates and forbidding travelers to enter. Yet even these desperate measures often failed once the disease had already slipped inside. The plague did not discriminate between king and peasant, priest and merchant, child and elder. Across Europe, the population shrank at a pace that seemed almost supernatural to those witnessing it. In many regions, nearly half the inhabitants vanished within a single year, leaving towns half empty and fields untended. The world that medieval Europeans had known for generations was collapsing before their eyes. And as the year 1349 unfolded beneath darkened skies and tolling bells, it became clear that the Black Death had only begun to reveal the full scale of its devastation. By the year 1349, the plague had tightened its grip across Europe, transforming once vibrant lands into landscapes marked by silence and dread. From the windswept shores of London to the fortified towns of the Holy Roman Empire, the tolling of church bells became the constant rhythm of daily life. Entire neighborhoods stood abandoned, their doors hanging open as if the inhabitants had vanished in a single, terrible night. The disease spared few, striking down farmers, craftsmen, nobles, and clergy with equal cruelty. In the great trading city of Bruges, markets that once overflowed with wool and spices fell eerily quiet as merchants succumbed to the sickness. Ships still arrived in port, but many carried crews already dying or dead before the anchors touched the harbour floor. Across the countryside, abandoned farms slowly returned to wilderness as crops withered and livestock wandered untended. The rhythms of medieval life, planting, harvest, trade, and worship, collapsed under the weight of relentless mortality. In monasteries, monks continued their prayers even as their numbers dwindled day by day. Some chroniclers wrote that entire religious houses perished almost completely, leaving manuscripts unfinished on wooden desks. Communities struggled to bury their dead with dignity, but the sheer number of bodies made proper rituals nearly impossible. Mass graves became a grim necessity in cities where space and strength had run out. The psychological toll of the disaster weighed heavily upon survivors, who watched their familiar world crumble around them. Many believed the plague was a punishment from God, a divine reckoning for the sins of humanity. Others sought answers in the stars, convinced that celestial forces had poisoned the air of the earth. Amid such uncertainty, movements of religious fervor swept across Europe. Bands of penitents, known as flagellants, marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public acts of repentance. Their processions passed through cities like Strasbourg, drawing large crowds desperate for any sign that salvation might still be possible. For a time, these rituals offered hope, yet the plague continued its advance regardless of devotion or spectacle. Authorities grew uneasy as the flagellant movement spread, fearing unrest in societies already strained to the breaking point. In many places, local rulers eventually banned the processions, trying to restore some fragile sense of order. But even kings and princes found their power weakened by the relentless death around them. courts struggled to function as advisors. Guards and servants succumbed to the same invisible enemy. Trade routes that once bound Europe together became thin threads as merchants avoided infected regions. Yet the plague still traveled along those fragile lines of contact, moving deeper into northern and eastern territories. In the bustling city of Hamburg, ships arriving from distant ports carried both goods and the ever-present shadow of disease. Citizens watched nervously as new outbreaks appeared among sailors and dockworkers. The fear of contagion reshaped everyday behavior, turning simple acts like conversation or shared meals into dangerous risks. Families often isolated their sick relatives in separate rooms, praying that the illness might somehow spare the rest of the household. Sometimes those prayers were answered, but more often the sickness consumed entire families in cruel succession. The death of so many laborers began to reshape the foundations of medieval society. Fields went unplowed, workshops stood empty, and landowners discovered they could no longer command the same obedience from a shrinking workforce. Survivors slowly realized that the old social order, built upon abundance of labor and rigid hierarchy, was beginning to fracture. Though the plague still raged across Europe, its devastating power was already setting forces of change into motion. And as the year 1350 approached, the continent stood exhausted and transformed, waiting in fearful uncertainty for the moment when the great storm of death might finally begin to pass. By the year 1350, after seasons of relentless death, the fury of the plague began to slow, leaving behind a continent profoundly changed. Across Europe, survivors emerged cautiously from shuttered homes and silent villages, unsure whether the invisible enemy had truly retreated. In cities such as Florence, once crowded streets now felt strangely spacious, their populations reduced by an unimaginable toll. Entire families had vanished, leaving houses abandoned and workshops forever quiet. The familiar sounds of trade and conversation slowly returned, yet they carried an undertone of sorrow that could not easily be forgotten. In the countryside, vast stretches of farmland lay uncultivated, where laborers had once toiled from dawn until dusk. Fields that had fed generations were now overgrown with weeds, and livestock wandered through broken fences unattended. Landowners faced a startling new reality. There were simply not enough workers left to restore the old rhythms of agriculture. As a result, surviving peasants discovered they could demand higher wages and better conditions for their labor. The balance of power that had defined medieval society for centuries began quietly shifting. In parts of England, villages near Norwich struggled to recover as the loss of population left churches empty and guilds depleted. Authorities attempted to control rising wages by passing strict labor laws, hoping to preserve the traditional order. Yet enforcement proved difficult in a world where workers were suddenly scarce and valuable. Opportunities emerged for those who had once lived on the margins of society. Servants became independent laborers, and small farmers acquired lands that had once belonged to powerful lords. In cities, craftsmen found themselves in greater demand than ever before, rebuilding communities that had nearly collapsed. Merchants cautiously reopened long dormant trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. Ships once again sailed between ports like Venice and distant markets, though memories of the plague lingered aboard every vessel. Communities also began to develop new strategies to guard against future outbreaks. Port authorities introduced early forms of quarantine, isolating arriving ships for weeks before allowing passengers ashore. Though rudimentary, these measures represented one of the first organized attempts to control epidemic disease. Meanwhile, the trauma left deep marks on the cultural and spiritual life of Europe. Many survivors questioned the institutions that had failed to protect them during the darkest days. Some turned toward intense religious devotion, while others drifted into quiet doubt about the established order. Artists and writers began capturing the haunting memory of the catastrophe in chronicles, sermons, and stories. Their words preserved images of deserted towns, mass graves, and the eerie stillness that followed the passing of the plague. In regions like Avignon, where the papal court had once struggled to minister to the dying, the church itself grappled with the scale of loss among its clergy. Yet life, stubborn and resilient, gradually pushed forward through the ruins. Children were born into villages that had only recently buried half their inhabitants. Markets reopened, bells rang again for weddings instead of funerals, and the sounds of rebuilding echoed through battered communities. Still, no one who had lived through those terrible years could forget the suddenness with which death had swept across the land. The Black Death had claimed millions, erasing nearly a third of Europe's population in a span of only a few years. Its devastation shattered assumptions about health, faith, authority, and the fragile nature of human society. From the ashes of that catastrophe emerged a transformed world, one in which labor, wealth, and power would gradually be redistributed. And though the plague would return in later generations, the memory of the great mortality of 1347 to 1351 remained etched into history as a warning of how swiftly civilization itself can be shaken by the unseen forces of disease.